Hello and welcome back to part two, chapter six of the Everlasting Man Book Club, The Five Deaths of the Faith. We are so happy to have you here. I'm happy to be back. Thanks for asking about my son. He is doing much better and he is home with mom for his convalescence, 12 weeks off his leg from his motorcycle accident, but God is at work in everything and in all of this. So I am so grateful to have Gregory Pyne here. He is a longtime conference attendee. He is a member of the Orlando Chesterton Society. He is a literature teacher. He is a father to three wonderful boys. He is a husband, and I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about himself. Hi, Gregory.
How are we doing, Susan? Good to see you guys. Yeah, I'm down here in the Florida area. Winter Garden, Florida is actually around where I'm from. I teach AP literature at a pretty large high school here in Florida. And yes, I have been so happy to be part of the Chesterton Society for quite a while now, it seems.
Yes, I remember my first conference was in Orlando, and I met you at the Afterglow, and we had a great time. And you were one of the highlights of the conference, and so it was nice to see you again this last year in Philadelphia and meet your beautiful wife. And so was just lovely. And so everybody knows, I hope, Gretelin and Joe. Gretelin is the host of Uncommon Sense, and so is Joe, and they are the co-hosts of this Everlasting Man book club. So hi, Gretelin. Hey, Joe. I wanted to do another icebreaker because I know everybody loves the icebreakers. The question today is, and I would like you to answer this in the chat as well, everybody, the folks from New Orleans, the folks from Maryland, the folks from Texas, all of you answer, what is your favorite vacation spot and why? So, Greg, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, well, I know we have. I saw a little bit earlier. We have Joan from Tampa, and I think she'll agree with me. My favorite vacation spot is St. Augustine, Florida.
Mm.
Absolutely wonderful place if you want ancient American history and the beach. There you go. Combination you can only get down here in St. Augustine, Florida.
Yes, it was beautiful. I went there for a night's pilgrimage, and I have to say, it was. I went to the castle of Saint Mark, right, Castillo
Yeah.
San Marco, and then the cathedral there, and the shrine of Our Lady of La Leche, gorgeous. The beach, everything was amazing. So I have to agree, that was really nice. What
And an
about?
update on
Oh,
that,
yeah.
they have the Baby Camino by the Order of Malta, hosted by them, is done that and is now officially part of the Camino de Santiago.
Oh, cool.
Wow, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out. Thank you. All right, Gretelin, vacation spot.
So is this like a dream vacation spot or somewhere we've actually been?
Either you decide.
Boy, cool. I'll just stick with what I've actually seen. Anyway, so I've been blessed to go to a lot of different places, but I think probably just for sheer joy of the outdoors, Bushkill Falls, Pennsylvania. It's called the Amazon of Pennsylvania. There are bears, so you got to watch out, or bring your firearms as needed. But there are like hundreds of waterfalls, and it was first made a vacation spot in the Victorian era. So there's a lot of old like walkways for the ladies with their dresses and their parasols. So it's nice to walk around. It's not. There's hiking if you want to do hiking, but it's very cool. It's and you can stay in the Poconos, and it's neat.
That sounds great. That's close to me, so I'm going to have to check that out.
It's cool. Your kids would like it.
Yeah, I bet. I bet it's on my list. I wrote it down.
Nice.
How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I had similar question to Gretelin. I mean, in terms of great places I've been, my old job used to take me kind of all over the place, but I decided things that are practical as maybe a repeat vacation spot, and so haven't been there in a few years. I don't know if it's still quite what it was, but I loved Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a big beer drinker, and it's one of the microbrew, if it probably the microbrew like capital of the United States. They have a lot of microbreweries, famous beer there, and I would we would rent a cabin kind of up in the Green Mountains, about 25 minutes outside of Asheville proper. So you kind of got the best of both worlds, because it was during the day you had kind of a bustle of a bohemian little town, and then in the evening you were up in the mountains above all the light pollution and you could see the Milky Way. So it was kind of the best of both worlds for my tastes anyway. So
Oh, that sounds lovely and very localist or distributist with all the microbrews. I like that. That's really good. So I'd have to say for me, I really like the outdoors and I like primitive camping. So Glacier National Park was just at the top of my list. I couldn't imagine staying in any hotel that would have the match the grandeur of leaving my tent in the morning and looking out at a mountain and then walking to a glacier fed lake. I just, there's no interior designer could decorate things as beautifully as God has decorated that park. The grandeur, and that when I went, I have to say it was the first time I saw the Rockies, and I grew up in the Midwest, and we'd go over to Ohio and saw the Appalachian Mountains, and they are indeed mountains, but they're not the Rocky Mountains. It's a totally different type of mountain. So I have to say that was just a beautiful place, and so if I could go back again, I would go back there. And I see a lot of people talking about the beach. I see people talking about all sorts of places in Italy, Hawaii, Ireland. So historic places, cultural places, and also places with beautiful landscapes. I think all of that is important. They all feed different aspects of our soul. So it's a wonderful thing to contemplate, because it's important, I think, for us to have that leisure. So, all right. So on to the book, The 5 Deaths of the Faith. I wanted to do something kind of fun and exciting, because now we're going to talk about death. So we're going on to the faith has died and risen again, hasn't it? So what is the purpose of this book? Chesterton goes over and over this again, doesn't he? He tells us the purpose several times throughout the book. But in this chapter specifically, Greg, I'm going to ask you, what does Chesterton say the purpose of this book is?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at what he's saying in the text, right? He's not specifically to trace the history of Christianity. What does he say here? He says, especially the later history of Christianity, which involves the controversies of which I hope to write more fully elsewhere, but devoted to the suggestion that Christianity, appearing amid heathen humanity, had all the character of a unique thing and even of a supernatural thing, right? So this kind of sense of Christianity being kind of separate from all the other kind of waves of ideas and even other religions that were around, and in conflict with some of those, or in competition with some of those, and even within itself, it's the religion that has died many times, because we have a God that finds his way out of the grave.
I love that quote. Isn't that amazing? Gretelin, do you have what are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So I love how he says that, this whole book, and he said this comes up over and over, that it's a difference in kind, not in degree, right? Like man is a different in kind than an animal. Christ is different in kind than a human, just a human, I should say. And then Christianity is a difference in kind than any other religion. It's not like it's a similar flavor. It's a completely different thing that you're not going to find anywhere else. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Joe, I thought of you because we had a discussion about how Chesterton was using this book as a defense of the faith and not necessarily an apologetic of Catholic versus Protestant. And I think this quote that Greg read addresses that issue. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think he'll get to that, and it's neat that Chesterton 2 times in this chapter, and I don't, forgive me, have the page numbers pulled up, but 2 times, actually 3 times, twice he makes reference to things he plans to handle in a future book or books, and then other times one time he makes reference to something he has treated elsewhere. I'm fairly sure that something he has treated elsewhere is referring all the way back to orthodoxy. and the topic matter that he covers there. And then I believe, the book that he comes to write that answers those questions that he probably has in mind at this point, and maybe is even sort of thinking through, is The Catholic Church and Conversion. So he does stay very refined in his thesis here, and I think that that's a great asset to the book, and it sort of functions parallel in ways in its function to a later book that would borrow many of its arguments by another author, namely Mere Christianity. So this is very much a modest mere argument by comparison with the really kind of weighty apologetics that he gets into elsewhere.
Right. I think it's enough for Chesterton in this book that Christianity was a revolution. So he's leaving all of these later quibbles, when the church starts to fracture in the Reformation period, for other books, which I think is great because it helps to think about the things that unite us, and it helps to think about the things that really make Christianity unique in the world, whether it's of a Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant flavor of Christianity. It really is something unique. So what has happened when Christianity died? As Greg said, Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. So what happens? What happens when Christianity dies, Greg?
There is always seems to be within the faith, by the adherents to the faith, or those without, that consider Christianity to be down and out and never returning again. And one of the things that I liked, it's a little bit later on, when he's talking about the problems of the Dark Ages, of the this is it right here. Again, Chesterton's language is just something that completely kind of overwhelms me sometimes. For those of you guys that have the book, this is on 432. If so, they would have been surprised at what did happen. You notice the number of times that the word surprise actually shows up in this chapter as well. What did happen was a roar like thunder from thousands and thousands of young men, throwing all their youth into one exultant counter charge through crusades, right? So here we have Christendom possibly, right, getting stamped out perhaps by Islam, but the rallying cry of the Crusades says, no, that's not going to be the case. That's not going to be, and the idea of this kind of roaring back as well, right? It's just kind of marvelous language that he's using.
Absolutely. Gretelyn, what are you thinking about this question?
Oh boy, it's such a good question. Yeah, I think that's a great point that you made, Greg, is that in the text he points out that it seems like it's dying, but all these youth are kind of behind it. I think we're seeing that in our own day as well. There's a great return to the faith in the young, and it's kind of amazing. But I think that's part of it, is that there's sort of an age-old longing in people, and Chesterton recognizes that the faith answers that. So even if it gets repressed or pushed down or watered down or whatever, there's going to be people who see it for what it is and will follow it, even if they have to find it first. So, yeah.
I like that. Joe, what do you have to add?
Not much. I think we've covered it well. I mean, only to say that I love this very consoling image of the church, in that, it's one thing to speak about Christianity dying, and immediately we may think of the persecutions, but as he'll go on to describe, sometimes Christianity seems to just die or wither out of old age, and even from those things it rises. And I don't know about, at least for us Western Christians in the modern age, we might be as much worried about the internal goings on in the church more than from external persecution maybe being our threat. And I have to admit, some of the rhetoric in this early part of this chapter reminds me of a quotation from Hilaire Belloc when Belloc says that, you know, he is bound to hold the church divine, but for unbelievers, a proof can be seen in the fact that no merely human institution run with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight, right? So, you know, and that might seem cynical and it might seem pessimistic even, but it's not. It's actually quite the opposite. It's paradoxically a very optimistic thing that this, you know, God's in charge and it's his spirit motivating the body of Christ. And so, as you put it, our God knows the way out of the grave, and he will lead his church
Yes,
that way all the time.
God is in charge, and quotes like that make me want to found a Bellic society because he is just amazing. You know, on page 428, it says, when Christianity rose again suddenly and through them, you know, the enemies, the Arians, it was almost as unexpected as Christ rising from the dead. And that word you said earlier, Greg, surprise, you know, it's a surprise to the people who are uninitiated. But I think to those of us who've seen the history, and as Chesterton just so masterfully shows us the history of the church, this gives us great hope and consolation. Like what Joe was saying, you know, we've seen this story before and we know the truth will prevail because we've been down and out, and it looked like, you know, on the cross, it looked like all was defeat, all was despair, all was misery. All they had risked their lives for was nothing, and their God was dead. And no, he wasn't, you know. And so no matter how bad things get or how bad we perceive they are, we know the end of the story. So
if you don't mind,
yeah.
Just, you know, I'm having a fine time teaching a course on Lord of the Rings, and one of Tolkien's ideas, and someone in the chat is mentioning Tolkien as well. One of Tolkien's ideas was this idea of eucatastrophe, the sudden change for the good, right? And I think our faith, our Christian faith, has time and again kind of shown that, right? To the point where you know, you would think, you know, after the apostles seeing all the miracles of Jesus, do you remember the point where he says, "Are you still so dull?" Right? You know, and we do have this kind of despairing aspect, maybe, you know, sometimes, but as Joe's saying, God's in charge, you know.
Yeah.
And
no matter.
and he is a God of surprises as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from Frank Sheed, who, if you know who Maisie Ward is, you know who Frank Sheed is. But he said, "We are not baptized into the hierarchy, do not receive the cardinals sacramentally, will not spend eternity in the beatific vision of the Pope. Christ is the point." And he goes on to say, "I myself admire the current Pope, but his point is, it doesn't even matter what you think about the church and her hierarchy, what they're doing right or wrong. That's not the point, right? The point is that Christ is at the back of it, and he's always going to be leading the ship." So,
absolutely, that gives us great hope, and I think Chesterton had that hope. So he's definitely trying to convey that through this book. So why is the faith then not a survival? I'm gonna read the quote that Dale got that question from, and then we can talk about it. We're on page 429. The faith is not a survival. It is not as if the Druids had managed somehow to survive somewhere for 2,000 years. That is what might have happened in Asia or ancient Europe, and that indifference or tolerance in which mythologies and philosophies could live forever side by side. It has not survived. It has returned again and again in this Western world of rapid change and institutions perpetually perishing.
Yeah.
So what does that mean to you, Greg, that eternal bark of Peter?
You know, in just on that same page on 429, you have another Chesterton just curveball of a statement where he says the sacred place of the Druids is safe from the vandalism of restoration, which I think that's just one of my favorite lines in this chapter, right? It's like, you know, there's that Chesterton curveball that we love so much there. And, you know, to what we were talking about Belloc. Belloc actually had a book, if I'm not mistaken, called Survivals and New Arrivals, where
Yeah.
he was talking about some of the things that Chesterton is certainly talking about in this book, but I think especially in this quote that you just read, Susan, right? In this Western world of rapid change and institutions perpetually perishing, right? The church as completely stalwart, as something that, as Chesterton said, it should be the church that doesn't move with the world, but moves the world, right? In that aspect of it's not the church grasping at being relevant. It's not the church grasping at being like the pinnacle of pop culture. Those are the things which come and are gone just like that. All right. And if you don't believe me, take a look at your wardrobe from, I don't know, 40 years ago and see what that was like.
All perfectly fashionable.
At the time, mullets were in. All right, I'm telling you,
that's the problem, right? They were fashionable, and now the fashions have
that was
moved
it.
on, right?
But the church is that kind of steady aspect that we have because we're on the rock, of Christ, right?
Well
Right,
said. I don't know if I have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I just like that idea of, my word will not pass away. We've got these things, and this is a theme through Christianity, but this is real. This is truth, right? So truth is gonna, no matter what the fashion, it's going to prevail. And so this is some comfort, and this is hope that we have, that even in the darkest times, even when Peter's on the boat and there's the ship, the waves crashing all around, he's got faith that God's gonna keep him safe. We can have that same faith that no matter how stormy things get, the truth will prevail.
There's a comment too on I don't know what you'd call it, but he talks about the church being like part of, like, it looks like it's part of this. It looks like it's part of the Roman Empire. Then the Roman Empire dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages die. So I think it's a comment on universalism. So like the universalism of the faith, right? So it's not like the church was conforming to Rome or conforming to the Dark Ages. It just fit those things because it fits everything. So in a weird way, like, you don't have to try to make the church relevant. It's already answering the deepest questions of our souls, right? So Chesterton certainly recognized that, and it's way more than, what kind of music is playing at church or whatever. It's so much deeper. It's just beautiful.
Yeah,
Right.
and I would just add on this note of it not being a survival, I think, wise as serpents, innocent as doves, right? That the church sometimes can adapt in certain ways to certain ages and in certain respects, but not in other fundamental respects. And if it had been a mere survival, I think what you would expect to see is some of the adaptation that you can see, or the reinventions and the re-articulations and, discovering new truth from a prophet or something that have happened elsewhere. But in the church, in every age, the church is a sign of contradiction. And that's the one thing that's consistent. And it might not always on the same points, so love your neighbor might be very popular nowadays. But do not fornicate, right? Not maybe so much as easily attended to. Whereas in different ages, maybe, in the Roman age, well, no, they were pretty big fornicators too. But you get what I'm saying, right? Like everything.
Puritan age. There you go.
Yeah. The church is always that thing that sticks out in society. It's always going to be that kind of, odd guest with excrescences that bothers you a little bit, and that's a good thing. That shows that this thing hasn't changed. This rock has stayed intact. So that's that's an important aspect of this argument that I think he's advancing.
Right. And the fact that so many people are willing to, willing to attempt to live a Christian life, even though it's difficult and even though it contradicts the spirit of the age. And even though, there's something there. Because if it was just taking the easy path, the path of least resistance, I think most of us would be out of here. Right. I mean, it's certainly easier to sleep in on Sunday, and it's certainly easier to, there's certain things, demands that the church places upon us, that seem more difficult. Of course, they lead to a life of flourishing and faith and grace. And so they end up being an easier way, but there's difficulty. We're picking up our cross and following a man who was crucified and rose from the dead, which is not an easy path.
Jeff Miller has a great quote there. Therefore, it is the paradox of history that each generation is converted by the saint who contradicts it most. Yay.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites.
Great.
That is a great quote. And so, as Joe pointed out, the church contradicts the age, and so do the saints that conform to the church. So, did you notice a prophecy of the culture of death in this chapter? I mean, he's been talking about that throughout the book, hasn't he? I mean, there's just been, it seems like it's all about the babies through the whole book. We've got people wanting to sacrifice babies, and I think even in our own time. So that's sort of a prophecy that goes backwards and forwards, isn't it? Seems like there's that spirit has never left.
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, this is where Chesterton didn't say, and somebody just kind of filled this in for me. It was like the next problem was going to come from not from Munich but Manhattan. Am I getting that quote right? I don't think so. But the idea that this sense of I would say, he mentioned Schopenhauer there, just a very pessimistic philosopher. I can remember in Orthodoxy, he would talk about, Chesterton kind of mentions the suicide booths as well. We have life that is either kind of completely tossed aside, as we do with the horror of abortion that we have, or it's like so self-oriented that I can modify what God has given me to a rather extreme degree, right? And so this is where you kind of, Chesterton is kind of, as he often does, is kind of like, floating lightly along, and then he just like hits it with something like this that kind of makes us look startlingly at the horrors that are around us, and yet the church is still there. And in fact, the mission of the church even has more resonance given the death that's around us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's that harrowing quote that they might have death and have it more abundantly.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh. That's
that inversion of the abundance of life that Christ offers us, and we hear about in the Gospel of John, that we would have death and have it more abundantly, and it seems in some ways that we even celebrate death. That there are people talking about shouting abortions, when in a past generation, people who were apologizing for abortion might say they wanted it to be safe and legal and rare, and describe it as a tragedy that happens when a woman's needs aren't met or society has somehow failed to provide. And now it's more, some consider it more of a celebration or something that doesn't need any apology, and something that can be engaged in wantonly, which is just terrifying to my mind. Or the thought of MAID, made in Canada, legalized euthanasia, assisted suicide, that they that it's even offered as an alternative to mental health treatment. Well, why don't we just, this is just too difficult. It's too hard. We can't treat your depression. And so, this is an easy way out, free of suffering. And we'll go ahead and do this. And death will be an answer. Not life, and life more abundantly, but death would be the answer to your question. This is the ultimate end game of pessimism,
Yeah.
which is a rejection of, I think, both of the spirit and of the body. So we have this, we're saying, neither really matters. And it's a complete rejection of the incarnation, which is that union of the spirit and the body, of God and man.
Great point from Jeff Miller. The irony of us celebrating death while avoiding all aspects of memento mori. And if you don't know, memento mori it's sort of a monkish motto. Remember, you will die, and the idea is not just to be morbid and think about death, but to remember that at some point, when you know not when, you don't know the hour, God is going to call you, and you need to live accordingly, right?
Right, and that we're more than just these bodies. That there's something else. There's both, and we're both. And I think that was interesting with the 5 deaths of the faith. Oh, that's the next question. Yeah. What does Chesterton say are the 5 deaths of the faith? And I thought it was interesting that within these 5 deaths of the faith, we have a couple of dualities going on. So, I'm going to go ahead and list them, and then we can talk about them. Chesterton says on page 437, at least 5 times, therefore, with the Arian and the Albigensian, with the humanist skeptic after Voltaire and after Darwin, the faith has, to all appearance, gone to the dogs. In each of these 5 cases, it was the dog that died.
Another good one.
He's always got a good one. You just have to.
So
you just have to be willing to listen, and you're gonna. I'm always laughing when I read Chesterton. But I thought it might be good if we start off with just some definitions. Arian and Albigensian. I know there's a joke. That the Dominicans were founded to fight the Albigensian heresy, and the Franciscans were founded to counter the Reformation. And so, that it just proves how much better the Dominicans are, that nobody knows what an Albigensian is anymore. So apologies to any Franciscans in the audience. It's just a joke. But okay, Arianism. Who wants to go with, let me just give me a good definition of Arianism. Arianism is named after a bishop, right?
Well, essentially, it's this denial of the divinity of Christ as a true divine figure. It gets very convoluted, but I think for the purposes of going through these 5, it's better to just stay stay with the broadest definition possible. You can really get into Arianism, but basically, it denies the hylomorphic nature, that Christ the man is fully, a creation and then sort of superseded by the Godhead, or possessed almost by the Godhead. So that's the general idea. So this denies the hypostatic union, which is sort of the central dogma of Christology in Orthodox Christianity. So,
right, and then that goes hand in hand with the Albigensians on the other side, right?
Yeah, and before I move away from Arianism, just to lay out the pattern that's going to follow with one of these other things, but probably most pronouncedly in the case of Arianism, of all 5 of these, we take it for granted. We're so far removed from this that it's hard to remember, but there's that infamous quote from, I believe, Jerome, that the whole world groaned and found itself Arian. This is also where the phrase Athanasius contra mundum comes from, because Athanasius was the great defender of the Orthodox Christology against the heresy of Arianism, and basically found himself seemingly alone, even against all the other bishops and all the other presbyters. He was exiled, and he was kind of on his own. And so it really would have seemed at the time that, well, the Church of Christ, Christianity, this is what this religion is going to morph into or become. That would have been the natural way of things. It takes a supernatural vision to see how and why that doesn't happen. So,
is this, just also clarify for me, if you don't mind, is this where St. Nicholas, is that the tussle that he got into as well?
Punched him in the face.
Allegedly, yes. Yeah, that St. Nicholas would have been so frustrated with Arius's preaching that he punched him in the face.
Yes, that
Um,
Saint Nicholas.
Yes,
Sorry.
that Saint Nicholas, the very same one.
Jolly
Whether or
Saint.
not it happened, it's a great story, right? So that's
Yes.
that's the important thing. It's worth remembering that orthodoxy is something to get fired up and willing to defend. Even defend vociferously. So
Punching heretics is a good pastime.
yeah.
Maybe if you're in the Belloc Society, Chesterton dealt with them a little bit more,
Yeah.
more kindly.
Yeah.
Chesterton would have a very, very proper duel.
Oh
Belloc would,
yeah, I think
Belloc would probably
Mhm.
just swing. You're right.
right. He might swing and say
might just
something
swing.
really harsh.
Yeah.
He has harsh words for a lot of folks. So
I think a Bella conference would be the only one that would have a boxing ring. Maybe, I don't know.
oh, that would be fun. You'd sit around and like sort of smoke cigars, drink beer, eat bacon, and insult one another. It would be like,
In French sometimes.
oh yeah, that would be perfect. That would be a lot of fun. So we've got the Arians, we got the Albigensians. Okay, and then after that we have the humanists, the humanist skeptics. So that's the next one, right?
Yeah, humanism
Yes.
would be circa Renaissance, if I'm not mistaken,
Right.
or around that area there. Yeah.
So that and then we have which is all of the sort of things where maybe the church had some things that it really needed some correcting, and so we were saying, oh, look at how sinful all these folks in the church are, and instead of saying, well, that means I must belong there too, people thought that was reason that it might not be right. And Voltaire. So Voltaire is referring to then the French Revolution, right?
French Revolution and just sort of the age of
Like,
rationalism,
yeah.
more specifically, especially given Chesterton's sort of odd proclivities on the French Revolution being a bit of a mixed bag. I think what he has in mind with Voltaire is chiefly the rationalistic skepticism coming out of kind of the high age of reason, as with Voltaire as sort of its cynical, skeptical standard bearer, right? And I don't know, forgive me if, just to give people, because this is one of those places where you need this version of the book, you need annotations, and even with the annotations you could go down rabbit holes. But in each of these cases, Albigensianism is warmed over Gnosticism. We didn't really quite cover that one, but it's basically a body soul dualism. There's actually more than that. There's a dualism in the whole of the universe, right? There's a fundamental evil and a fundamental good power. Some of the Albigensians wouldn't go so far as to say there's like a good god and an evil god, like ancient Manichaeans or Gnostics did, but it's still that kind of idea that evil is a positive thing and it kind of is up against God. And that trickles down.
Star Wars. It's Star Wars.
It's Star Wars,
wondering.
indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
the good force, the bad force, and they need each other somehow.
that's a great call out. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then
this is my problem with Star Wars, but we won't go there.
Yeah.
Well,
and humanism
Disney
for another popular referent, or a referent people will be familiar with, humanism is basically sympathy for the devil, or if you want to think of Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, this is the humanist skeptics that Chesterton mentions Marlowe, but Milton would be sort of the same ilk, that man on his own is sort of and great, and then also that maybe the devil had some of the right ideas in rebelling and declaring his own freedom from the tyranny of this design that man was supposed to follow. So
you can kind of see these growing out of each other, can't you? It's like the Arianism and the Albigensian, the humanism definitely comes from that.
They're not very original.
Yeah. Not very original, no. And then Darwin, everything is progress. We're just moving towards all the best stuff. Aren't we great? Yeah.
Yeah, this age of science and reason that has gone past, that we've somehow evolved. And certainly that's something that Chesterton's arguing against this entire book, that, that man has somehow reached some sort of pinnacle. There's even an idea in some branches of Catholic theology that like we're getting better and better, and we're going to reach this omega point or this some. I just I have a hard time with that concept. I have a hard time with that idea. Just looking at humanity, looking at myself, and I'm certainly not better than my grandparents. I'm certainly not better than my great grandparents. I think that. I think that Chesterton's right to point out how these things tend to go in cycles, and we're making the same mistakes over and over again. And so we're not, we're kind of putting our prejudices back on the caveman to say that he was a different type of creature, but we certainly don't have any evidence for it.
Mm.
We don't have any evidence for it. So
original sin is not going anywhere.
no, we definitely see the effects, don't we? And so to see, and to see the damage, certainly that's caused by this idea that we are no more than an evolved ape, I think leads to some ideas that we see in our modern time that, we're not responsible for our behaviors. We can't be expected to conduct ourselves with any type of propriety, because after all, animals do certain things, so we must do certain things, which is really, if you think about it, somewhat degrading to say, well, I saw a monkey do something like that the other day, so I'm pretty sure you can't help yourself. Monkeys like throw poo at each other at the zoo, and I managed to restrain myself from doing that, even if I'm super angry. So somehow there must be something going on in this human, at least beyond what a monkey can do. So I think also we would extend that courtesy to every other human on the planet, that there's got to be something more.
Yeah, especially as we get into Darwin, as we get into modernism, there's a degrading of the human self. There's also a degrading of nature, and of course Chesterton addresses this, in the early 20th century. You had the eugenics movements, and it seems like humanity itself almost became like a science experiment unto itself, right? Of like, how do we parse each other out? How, and like you were saying, Susan, just the reduction to behaviorism, etc., right? So, what is simply just the wiring that's going on there, and are we hardwired to do this, and that's it, and kind of negating free will, there's a real, despair that comes with that as well, I think.
There's a bit of a even darker side too. I have a friend who's a biologist, and she said it's not like a huge leap to, if you don't believe in God and you do believe in evolution to that degree, why can't you experiment on human beings?
Yeah,
which is kind of scary,
right?
But she's working with people who are doing experiments, so this is kind of it's a thought process that's not absent from
modifying genes, and we've seen this happen. They're modifying genes to make an embryo more resistant to HIV, or to make them more intelligent, in countries that have more lax ethics laws regarding experimentation, or in places, even in the United States, where ethics rules aren't necessarily enforced. There's been a darker side of science experimented on. Karen points out that there's evidence that our genetics are actually degenerating. And I've heard that too, that somehow, it's not inconceivable to think that before the fall and before original sin, that somehow things were, God created us, right? God created our first parents, and why wouldn't he create them with a level of perfection? He created them without original sin. So we see epigenetic changes in times of famine and war and stress, where there are actual changes to the DNA because of those external factors. So with all the environmental pollution and with the the stressors of modern society, it would make sense that would be a possibility. So it's a good thing that he did such a good job creating us, because we're still around despite all these challenges. Right. But definitely, I don't see things getting better. We see some general signs of decay that as Karen points out there. So why is Protestantism not listed as one of the 5 Des of the faith? I think this is a great point that Dale brings out here with this question.
Well, he says that he's not going into that, so there's that.
Well, there is that.
Yeah, but I don't know.
But I like what he has to say. I don't know. I think it's worth an extended read here, just a little bit of one. We're on page 442, and we're talking about dilution. It says in the middle of the page here, it says, again and again before our time, men have grown content with a diluted doctrine. And again, there has followed on that dilution, coming as out of the darkness in a crimson cataract, the strength of the red original wine.
Yeah.
And we only say once more today, as has been said many times by our fathers, long years and centuries ago, our fathers or the founders of our people drank as they dreamed of the blood of God. Long years and centuries have passed since the strength of that giant vintage has been anything but a legend of the age of giants. Centuries ago already is the dark time of the second fermentation, when the wine of Catholicism turned into the vinegar of Calvinism. Long since that bitter drink has itself been diluted, rinsed out, and washed away by the waters of oblivion and the wave of the world. Never did we think to taste again even that bitter tang of sincerity in the spirit, still less the richer and the sweeter strength of the purple vineyards, in our dream of the age of gold. Day by day and year by year, we have lowered our hopes and lessened our convictions. We have grown more and more used to seeing those vats and vineyards overwhelmed in the water floods, and the last savor and suggestion of that special element fading like a stain of purple upon a sea of gray. We have grown used to dilution, to dissolution, to a watering down that went on forever. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. That last line, I'm like, yes, like it's still here, this faith is here. And, this again is such a hopeful thing. I think Chesterton is bringing out here, that no matter, what type of, people sometimes complain of the catechesis of the 70s and the 80s. My brother-in-law calls it the be kind to dumb animals theology. That it's just about being a good person, and nobody ever died for that. Just be a good person. That's not something that really steals your spine and makes you ready to go out into battle, and this faith is here, even when there's attempts to dilute it. We have this heritage.
That dilution is we were talking about that kind of temptation to despair is kind of where I think this dilution comes from sometimes, right? And it's a very powerful line that he says, we have lowered our hopes and lessened our convictions, right? And especially with the faith that we hold, that's really something. And if I'm not mistaken, part of the one of the sins against the spirit, I guess, is one of despair as well, right? Not for nothing. So we have this this wonderful imagery of the wine. It takes us right back to the wedding feast. It takes us right back to the Last Supper, the institution of the Eucharist, right? And we have that in our own lives, I think. We have this in our lives where we have those ebbs and flows of our own spiritual life. We ourselves, we get tired and we get tapped out, and we're not making that kind of same connection with God that we either feel that we should, or is it there anymore? And I'm wondering if Chesterton is saying, like, collectively, right? The church can kind of go through these waves, but God being the ever-present vineyard owner that he is, that wine is always going to be there, always going to be there. And it seems to be, right, when we're moaning about it the most, that we find these pockets of vibrancy, right? And I don't mind putting it out there that I think the Chesterton Society is kind of like that, and other kind of movements that we see in the church, and you look at it and it's like, oh, there it is right there. I'm not going to worry so much.
Well, my husband and I talk too frequently about how absolutely spoiled we are in this country and in many countries, that confession is so available we can forget about it, right? The Eucharist is there every day, and we don't even like this. The idea is that we just take this for granted so hard, and I don't know. It's not a guarantee that it'll always be there. It's not been a guarantee that it has always been there. But it's just such an amazing thing that, we believe that God came and then he stayed and locked himself in a little box and just waits for us. It's so really incredible love. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it's I don't know.
It's a beautiful, beautiful gift. Beautiful that we can keep going back to that treasury. So I had a question that kind of came off of this: is what is worse for the faith? Is it worse for the faith to be diluted or to die?
Man,
I know what I would say, but I don't know what to say.
Well, I think in a certain sense, right, I would draw a point of continuity between the two. And my answer to the question from the back, why is Protestant not listed, is because it's, in a certain sense, it's not any different. If you look at all the other things, everything he covers in here post Christ, he basically avers is of Christ in some way. It's changed and shaped by it. Even Islam is, in Chesterton's account, a Christian heresy. Albigensianism was so is Arianism. Voltaire came out of a Christian climate and culture. Science, for as much as the age of scientism grew out of proportion, the Catholic Church was the great patron and advancer of science, right? So I would say that, like, it's all one and the same, the dilution and the death. What I would say Chesterton's pointing towards is a pattern. I think maybe one is more dangerous in the sense that you don't notice it as easily, right? You're the slowly boiled frog, which apparently is a myth. I was very upset to hear about that, but yeah. But if the slowly boiled frog was a real thing, right? That's the kind of dangerous situation you don't want to be in, because you don't notice that gradual dilution. You do notice the vandals at the gate. So there is that I would say is a distinction. But otherwise, I think what Chesterton is reassuring us of is the church is subject to neither. It can't really not die lastingly. This wine, because it's not of our making, and it can't be diluted, not lastingly, not effectively. So that's great consolation. But I think, in terms of watching and staying awake and paying attention, it's worthwhile paying attention to the temptations to dilute where we may see them. That's the other great thing about this chapter is while it's so broad in scale and kind of does this sweeping treatment of 2,000 years, it's really applicable to everyday life, because the same modus operandi is the life of the Christian. Unless a grain of wheat die, it cannot, grow again and have life, right? So that death and life, that resurrection motif is arguably even more so in the life of every of Christ's followers to be lived out and maintained.
Well, he has that part in here, and I can't find it. I was looking for it. It might be earlier. It's in this chapter, though, where he says basically that the church would get sort of buffeted by these heresies, and it wouldn't come out of it more simple, more pure in that way. It would come out with theology, with some complex answer to kind of push back, and it goes back to that key image, right? It gives it this very this sort of very complex shape.
Right. I think that also refers back to that chapter, The Witness of the Heretics, where the church is refined by the heresies that challenge it.
Yes.
So So we're running out of time. What has happened when the church has been wedded to the world? I'm just going to read what Chesterton has to say so we can get to some comments maybe. It is said truly enough that human Christianity in its recurrent weakness was something too much wedded to the powers of the world. But if it was wedded, it has very often been widowed. It is a strangely immortal sort of widow. So, to the extent that we've wedded ourselves to the age, we've eventually become widowed because the church is always going to outlast temporal things because it's something eternal. Because the church isn't just a thing; it's a body of Christ. So it's an eternal thing. So,
Amen.
so do we have any questions? I didn't notice any. Oh, I got a couple here up in the. Let's see what we've got going on here. Oh, something about GKC describe the bark of Peter being a submarine. This is a Joe question, or maybe a Gretelin one, or maybe you, Greg, because I
Somebody-
certainly don't know the answer.
Somebody said orthodoxy. Is that true?
Well, so Bob both asked the question and then answered
Yes.
it. So he because I said I wasn't aware of the reference, and I still don't recall kind of what that was in reference to. The bark of Peter reference, or where you're pulling that, Bob, from. It may be Father Shaw. It could very well be Father Shaw on Chesterton, and maybe taking this quote and applying it specifically to the the church as this ship image. But it was that was definitely a fun question. So
Yeah. Yeah, Chesterton's got some really beautiful images, doesn't he? And he definitely shared a bunch of them with us in this chapter. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us on this discussion of this last chapter. We've got the conclusion next week. So Gretelin, Joe, and I will be here to talk about the summary of this book. Maybe we'll be talking about future plans. Think about it. Would you like to see something like this again? Would you like us to discuss something else? We would love to hear your ideas. As always, we would love for you to email us at podcast@chesterton.org with any feedback, with, like I said, suggestions for possible future book clubs. This is a pale image of what a local society meeting is. Imagine being in a room with a dozen friends, maybe 20 friends, your favorite beverage, some snacks, you get together, you know each other, you sometimes attend other events together in your community. Maybe you pray a rosary beforehand because you've got a Francis Chesterton Rosary League going on. You discuss an essay. You have a say every week in what the essay is going to be next month. And these local societies are places that I have met some of the people I love most in the world. So I would love for you to have that in your local community. So if you're interested in that, you can always email local societies at chesterton.org or just Susan@chesterton.org. We keep it simple over at the society. So emails are easy to figure out. So we would love to hear from you about that. These programs are only here because of your support. We have a great group of knights who support us and our schools with monthly donations. And we have members who receive our amazing Gilbert magazine and who are really sustaining the heart of our organization. They help us to keep the lights on, to provide this type of hope in a world that needs this type of hope. And so we would love for you to partner with us in that, to bring the message of Jesus Christ to your local community and to the world at large, because this is a message that we all need. And so I thank you for your time going through this book. I hope you join us, even though it's not an official chapter. Next week will be great. We'll love to have you with us. And until next week, remember that Chesterton is always better with friends.